the lights down here. Okay, good. That's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. That was very nice. There's two kinds of introductions. There's the introduction, which I normally get, which is essentially somebody reading what I've sent them. And then there are the introductions from what I consider to be my real friends who know more than what I could send them. And I really appreciate it when you say those things, and I feel honored to be a friend and to be part of what's a little part over the years of what's going on here. And this afternoon was extraordinary. In the last 2 or 3 years, and I've been here several times in the last 2 or 3 years, the department and the landscape architecture program has just flowered. And I had a fabulous afternoon, quite varied and very exciting. So what I'd like to do tonight is to talk to you a little about the memorial, but not the stuff you read in the papers and all of that, which is to some extent they're still raising money, is to some extent is self-serving in their part, and to some extent is not really, I think, what designers need to know about this kind of thing. And what I'd like to do tonight or this afternoon is to talk about things that came before. Some of them are things that we did when we were working on the project, but some of the things are things that we did before we even knew there was a project, and certainly that we knew there would be 9/11. And I give them sort of equal time because I'd like, you all are designers, and I'd like you to know something of what goes into something like this, that even though we've gone on for 10 years now, an awful lot before had influenced this, and I'm going to try and tell that story and explain that. I think the way to start, I always start talking about 9/11, and you have to look at it as an awful phenomenon. And clearly it's awful because it was the first time we were attacked on our own soil. It was an incredible attack by anyone's measure. And that in itself was enough to cause this to become a memorial. But I also think that this was an attack that was seen on television, and that 102 minutes from the time the first plane hit until the second tower went down, everyone has seen that loop. Not just in the United States, certainly not just in New York, but all over the world, because television is now everywhere. And those loops are being played, and they play them every September 11th. They had the ceremony today, and I'll talk a little about that. But that has gone on now for over 10 years. And that brings attention in a contemporary way to something that in many ways larger issues, much larger issues, have not had that kind of awareness, that kind of interest, and therefore people watching what happened afterwards. And that watching is a lot of the story that I want to talk to you about, because we have been observed and people feel part of this thing to an excruciating degree. And so I've never done a project quite like this, but being in this particular crucible for this length of time is something that I never expect to see again, and in many ways I don't think you could have any more of those in one lifetime. Now here we're seeing right after the attack, and any of you who come from New York or who tried to get down there, you couldn't get in. They had blocked it all off. I tried about 2 weeks after the attack. I was in New York and I had a meeting with an architect downtown, and I couldn't get to his office. It was impossible. They have it all blocked off. And I have a lot of friends in New York, and everyone was traumatized. I mean, in a way that I have not seen, kind of a universal way I have not seen. And then 3 years later, this is the site cleaned up. Of course, all the buildings, debris, everything is gone. But this is the way the site was when I first did see it. And I saw it a little before 2004, but this is the way the site was when I did see it. And this was the site at the time that all the competitions and the various plans for rebuilding began. I first met Michael Arad, young architect, when he called me on the phone, and he said that he was a finalist, one of 8 finalists, to do this project. And he had been advised by the jury, which is an extraordinary jury. They sat for almost 2 years. And he had been advised of the jury that he needed to find a landscape architect. In fact, I think my friend Michael von Valkenburg, who was on the jury, probably suggested our name to Michael, because I'm not sure he knew who we were. But he did call us up. And at the time that he called, he asked us to be on his team, and at the time that he called, I didn't know which scheme he had done. So I told him that, you know, I could see this was going to, we had been in the competition, we didn't win anything, and I told him that this was a huge commitment, it was going to take years, going to be very difficult, and that I needed to talk it over with my partners. But in fact, what I needed to do, and my partners too, needed to go to the website, as we all do, and see which scheme it was that Michael had authored. And as it turned out, when we saw it, it probably, of the 8, was the only scheme that I think we could have made a major contribution, intellectual and physical. And I don't know whether Michael was aware of that. I mean, he'd undoubtedly seen our website, but it was clearly true. And the reason it was true was that I'm a collector of contemporary art. I've been doing it for 35 years, and I collect minimalist art. And if you're a collector, you haunt galleries and you haunt museums and you get every piece of paper you can. You read about all these artists. You learn as much as you can. I mean, that's the sort of fanatics of a collector. And I knew Michael Heiser's work down in the left-hand corner. And the minute that I saw Michael's scheme, I thought of Michael Heiser. And I'm terribly fond of his. This is a piece that's now in Dia Beacon. It sits in a huge concrete floor, a huge room, like a factory, and then there is this giant hole in the floor. And that's all it is. It's basically trying to make you aware of nothingness. And that is the genius of Michael's scheme, is that he's essentially representing buildings that aren't there anymore. And along with the death and destruction and all of that, the fact that those buildings came down in such a short time and the fact that they were photographed is the heart of the matter. And Maya Lin loved this scheme, but she hated the site plan. And those voids are where the buildings were. And Michael had, I think he had 4 pine trees somewhere. It isn't in that sketch. But the rest of it was 7 acres of stone. And the mayor hated that and said that this is much too large an area, and a number of writers wrote about this. This was too much area to give over to a memorial. It wasn't popular to say that, but many of them thought this. And the mayor, we heard, said that this is a tremendously dense neighborhood, particularly when the new buildings, which are going up now, get up. And that even with Battery Park and all, there just isn't enough public open space. And so what the mayor was talking about is that this had to be a usable public open space and had to be, in a sense, both a park and a memorial at once. And of course, the difficulty is if you put a park, and rolling grass and shrubs and so forth around this, you would do great damage to the memorial itself, because the key to the Heiser piece is this plane into which this hole has been dug. And I think that was one of the reasons that I felt so strongly. So I called him back up and I said, yes, we'd love to do it. Now the scheme itself was on the top. He had raised the level up, and the rules of the competition were that it all had to take place 30 feet below the level of the street. That the whole thing had to be a hole. And Michael had raised it up, and there are a number of things that happened there. One was that you got this hole, and these are huge. They're 200 foot on a side. They're virtually an acre. And the surprise of the size of the openings has a lot to do with the character of the idea of the buildings being gone. It's a dramatic representation of them being gone. And then down below, you can see there's a series of ramps, and you come to this lower area, and you get to be on the back side of the waterfalls, and the names were to have been on the back side. So you come down into this tomb, down these long ramps and into this tomb, and then the names would be below. We'll talk about it a little bit later. There's some problems with that, but it was a dramatic thing, and I think all of us felt that going down into the tomb was an integral and important part of what this scheme was. Now I mentioned that I'd been collecting modern art, and one of my favorite artists is an artist called Carl Andre. Here are 3 pieces of his, and I remember seeing this picture of this meadow, just an ordinary meadow surrounded by trees, not a bad space, not a terrific space, nothing you would particularly remember. But this gesture of putting railroad ties across it. If you walked in here, or you rode your bicycle down here, or rode a horse in here, you'd never forget this meadow. It's a gesture which brings alive and makes particular that meadow. And that's one of the things that Carl Andre has taught us artistically. In the lower right-hand corner, I remember walking into a gallery in Portland, Oregon. And this was upstairs. You walked up some stairs and you went in. And this piece that he did on the floor was one of the first floor pieces I'd ever seen. And there are a series of concrete blocks with different sized pebbles, random pebbles on top of it. And I remember walking in that door and thinking, there's nothing on the walls. This is all on the floor. And yet very few rooms that I have walked into with beautiful paintings on the walls or sculpture standing in the room hit me as strong as this. And clearly there's a metaphorical relationship to the landscape, but I couldn't quite see that. I envied both of these pieces for their economy. We at this time, we're doing housing projects, and we'd have 170, 180 pages of working drawings in order to get these things built. And the way I looked at it, they weren't nearly as strong as these pieces. Now, Carl's classic piece is the upper right-hand corner, which are plates of metal. He's done many of these things, and they're about 1/8 of an inch high. But they command the space above them. They're really strong, like a great carpet. If you had a great Persian carpet in a very large room, huge carpet, and laid it down, you wouldn't put a chair on it. It would command the space above it, and that would be the sculptural move, even though it had no mass whatsoever. It was completely spatial. But I couldn't see how you could make a landscape out of checkerboards. It just seemed to be too kind of empty. And in that time, I thought that was a bad thing. So in the middle 70s, I was teaching at Harvard. I'd begun to teach at Harvard. And one summer, Bill Johnson and I took a group of Harvard and Michigan students. Bill was a partner, an old friend of mine. Some of you may know him. And he was dean of landscape at Michigan. And we took a group, and we started off in tour, and we went up the Loire and saw the chateau. And we were the students walking around talking about them. It was a wonderful trip. Took 6 weeks. Had a terrific time. And one day, in that trip, I was sitting on the steps of Vaux, looking out across the garden, back when I had hair, and I was looking at this garden and still kind of troubling this thing about the implications of this more modern way of looking at landscapes. And I suddenly realized that Lenote had figured this problem out. And what he'd done, and what I, my little light bulb that day, was that he'd flattened the landscape. It was one of his primary tools. And this is a Vaux, like Versailles, and most of the things around Paris are in rolling countryside. And he'd cut down all the trees and flattened the site in a series of plains. And what occurred to me that day was that if you do that, then anything you put on that plain has power. It could be those little gumdrops, it could be people walking around, it could be a piece of sculpture, but it made the things above it powerful. And that idea changed my whole life, even more than being a collector. So Martha Schwartz was on that trip, and we went home. We were living in Back Bay in a townhouse, and we had a roof that was leaking. We had to put a new tar and gravel roof on it. So we decided, as well as putting this roof on, we would make a garden up there. And it had to be largely synthetic, and we didn't have a lot of money. So we had to use the things that were on the roof, like skylights and stuff, but we also had to make things that exploited this flatness and tried to make something of the flatness. Let me just talk about two things. There are a number of others. If you look on the left-hand slide, these are a series of mirrors which we changed their size over time because we wanted to get mirrors which are in the same proportion as the windows across the way. So when we came at the end of the day and had drinks up there, when the lights were going on in Back Bay, you'd get these things reflecting the last light of the sky, and you'd get the windows coming on very softly, and this parterre with Bassin are taken across the street and reflected in the windows in the buildings on the other side. And we noticed, and one of the things about having a garden yourself, and not very many landscape architects have a garden, but if you have a garden yourself, you start noticing things about them. And remember, these ideas were coming out of Lenote, but they had begun as minimalist art. And one of the things we noticed is that when the shadow went across the roof, the Bassin still reflected the sky, which was something that you would never sit down with a notebook and figure out. This is something you really have to see to know. On the right-hand side, Martha found out that you could buy flower pots in 1-inch diameter. Different pots would be 1 inch less. And if you started off with 12 or 14-inch pot, and then the next one were 11, and the next one were 8, and then, going on, you could produce a false perspective, which is, again, one of Lenote's great tricks, to make that roof seem larger and make that distance seem greater. And we argued for days and days about what we would put in the pots. Would we put pebbles in them? Would we put little plants and so forth? And finally we decided that we would paint the pots sky blue. So in a way they were doing the same thing as the Bassin of the mirrors. They were bringing the sky and essentially reflecting the sky back up. Now that seems simple, but it's pretty complicated stuff. And it's stuff that I don't think I had ever seen anyplace else, and therefore we thought it was pretty cool, and we started acting on that. The next project we had, we were asked by the curator of the museum at MIT if we would do a May Day garden, for reasons too complicated to explain. And we did a garden, a one-day garden, made out of Necco wafers. Do you know what those are? Those little candies that are covered with sugar? And we found some spare tires, and Martha's sister and her boyfriend sprayed those things the same kind of little sugary colors. They're all in those pastel colors as the Necco wafers. And then we did just a Malevich, a twisted grid, no big deal. But it filled the whole great court at MIT, which is huge. Now our roof was a little tiny little roof. It was 18 feet wide and 60 feet long. This thing was really big. And with even more trivial means, we were actually able to command this. My students at Harvard got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and we came and laid this thing out. And we noticed that in the Neckos, they have chocolate ones and they have licorice ones. And we told everybody to eat the chocolate ones and the licorice ones because they didn't read against the lawn. So you just used the light colored ones. And this used to be, that was my favorite candy. I have a sweet tooth and I would have those beside my bed. And I've never had a Neckos after this day. We had a lot of Neckos that day. So anyway, this we did early in the morning. And when students came around 8:30 or 9 to classes, they suddenly saw these tires and these Neckos out in this hallowed space where they have, their graduations and all. And they were outraged. And in the paper they said, we're wasting food, blah, blah, blah. And we said, well, look, this is food that comes from across the street. Because Necco stands for New England Confectionery Company, and they are right across the street from the main doorway into MIT. And we went over there and sweet-talked a couple of boxes out of the guy, and we made the whole garden out of those boxes of leftover Neckos. So I was disturbed by this. Martha thought that was cool, but I was disturbed by this. And I remember talking to Frank Gehry afterwards, and I said, Frank, the people really hate this garden. And I said, that's not what landscape architecture is about. You're supposed to like it. He said, no. He says, you're onto something. He says, keep going. So he was more used to that kind of reception than I was. Gradually, this idea of flatness started creeping into our other work, and we found reasons for doing it. This is the sculpture garden Renzo Piano, our sculpture garden for Nasher in Dallas. And this is not a museum, because Ray Nasher had 600 sculptures, all of museum quality, and many of them fairly large. And the garden, depending, could only hold about 25 at any given time. So if you're cycling 600 through this thing, you're going to have a lot of changes. But what we wanted to do is produce a field of grass that could hold these sculptures and could also be strong enough that trucks could come in and move them in and out. And the way to do that was to produce a new kind of soil, which was largely made of sand, shale. And that would give you the compression strength, but would allow the water to go through, so we didn't need any catch basins. So we didn't need any grading to get the water out. The water would go down 6 or 8 feet and then dissipate into the aquifer. And so we were able to get something that was perfectly flat. Now, why were we concerned about that? Well, sculpture, by and large, relates to this relates to the earth, and then it's generally perpendicular or horizontal on that plane. And even people like Sarah, who do tip planes and so forth, they are playing against the accepted norm. They're playing against the same kind of thing that we all have. You're standing up and you're basically vertical. That's the way you stand. And sculpture is no different. So we needed this flat plane in order to play up the sculpture. The other thing about this garden, I talked to Doug Christmas, who's a gallery owner, was here at the Ace Gallery here in New York, and he was a friend of Ray Nasher's, and he said, Pete, if you want to please the sculptors, put a grid of trees out there, and then they will play against that in the same way that they play against the walls in a museum. We didn't do exactly a grid, but we did a complex set of grids. And it's true, the sculptors have actually loved to be there. And you can see in the upper ones just how flat it is and how the shadows play and how the sculpture stands. Still, it's outside. And one of the things I always point out is that when you're outside, there are seasons. And the trick with seasons is to get people to see them. And when you're dealing with a sculpture garden, the seasons have to give you a different setting for the same sculptures throughout the year. And that changing of the seasons is really important. But now everybody knows that, And everybody goes around and says, oh, it's spring, or it's fall, or it's winter. And that's the end of it. You know, that's just the way the landscape is. So the problem was to do this in precise enough terms and with the sculpture so that they actually saw it, and that they would come back to see the sculpture in snow, or come back to see the sculpture in spring or in the fall, and start getting that kind of relationship to the people who were coming. And that's been a large part of our work for a long time. The second one is with Helmut Jahn. It's the Sony Center in Berlin. And this is a really interesting thing. There's a great tent on the top of this. And this is a series of offices and apartments and shops at the lowest level. And the great court, which is about 350 feet long, so it's really big. And down below is a movie Metroplex. And this is the floor, or the roof, you might say, of that plaza. And what we tried to do here is make a plaza which was apparently flat. And the way we did it is we had a series of metal pavements here, these silver stripes, and then small dark cobbles between them. And these were the drains, and this is the high point here. And the water goes off the high point, doesn't go very far, and goes into the drain. So when you look across, you don't know that there's any grading at all. And part of, when I use the example of the rug, or the carpet, or Andre for that matter, is he puts a pattern on these things which tautens the surface. And that's, of course, what Lenote does with the parterre embroidery. He puts a little pattern on it, and you feel the tension of that flatness. Now, again, this is not somebody, you can't go up to somebody who's walking around Vaux or Versailles and say, you know what's working here? Well, of course, they don't know what's working here. But in fact, the flatness is working. And so that's all this is, including the lights which are set in. So everything is built up to make that flatness count. Below this plaza is as I mentioned, is a movie theaters. And we cut a hole in the flatness and directed your eye down into the lobby of the theater. And when you went down in the theater and looked back up, this pool has a glass bottom. So you're looking up through the skylight, up through the pool, and all the way to Helmut's great tent above. So what we did is we used the flatness and then put a vertical line of sight through it, which again is stepping one step further along this line of how one can exploit this particular aspect of landscape. Now, we don't do every landscape flat, but when we do get this chance, this is an opportunity for us to extend our knowledge and our ability to manipulate that particular idea. This next one is Saitama Plaza. We won a competition. There were 600 plus competitors, and this was in a center. Tokyo is having a terrible time of getting people in on the train to the various centers. There isn't enough space on the tracks to carry enough people in the trains to get them in and out of their centers. And so they're now building a series of sub-centers. And the Japanese, in their really wonderful way, decided, well, we'll build the center of the center first, and then we'll build the buildings around. Completely un-American way of looking at things. And so everybody turned in these deconstructed and really violent schemes, things breaking up and swirls and all sorts of things. And we suggested a grove of Zelkova, all identical, and standing on this flat surface. You see them here. And they're growing in essentially 2 meters of soil. And the bracing and the drainage is down below. And the terrace material is half stone and half grading. So this is an absolutely flat terrace that I don't think there's any other one in the world, and only a maniac would bother doing it. But at the same time, this was perfectly flat, and then the trees, of course, are the verticals coming out of that. And to make it more maniacal, this is a building, ITT of the architects, and Yoji Sasaki, it was our joint landscape architect. The glass building, we brought the dirt right up to the glass in the building. So it was a dirt spandrel. And it was like an ant farm. So when you went up the stairs or went up the elevators, you were going past this ant farm, which is what the trees were growing in. And so again, it was trying to make something that's inorganic into something that's organic. Something that is completely natural in a certain way, but expressed in a completely unnatural way. And again, the seasons are everything. These trees are the most beloved tree, I think, in Japan, the most often used. And the zelkovas they're deciduous, and they go through all the cycles. And I think we have 280 trees here, and only in Japan or maybe Switzerland could you get them perfectly matched. I've never had, including the memorial, I've never had anything quite so beautifully done. And this is what the result was. Oops, go back here. In the center of the plaza, we needed a place where you could have boat shows and automobile shows, and they could flood with water so they could have ice skating in the winter and so forth. So we made this concrete thing with a whole series of glass lenses going through it, a little like those things in the department stores in New York where you walk along the street and they let the light into the space below. Well, what happens is there's a food court below this thing, and in the daytime the light comes through this plaza and lights the food court. And of course at night the food court is lit and it lights the plaza above it. So again, it's all about ways of trying to exploit flatness and pattern in order to make you feel that flatness and make it really strong. Again, with the trees in going through the seasons. So this is what I knew, and this is what we knew how to do. And I like to think that Michael knew that, but this is what we knew when he called. So I called him back up and said, yeah, we would love to do it. And so from that Thanksgiving all the way up through Christmas, we faxed things back and forth. Sketches of his, sketches of ours. Increasingly, he would send us manifestos, things he wanted to tell the jury. And my job all through this was basically to limit the number of things that went back to the jury, because the jury loved what they had. They only needed to be encouraged that we could do the other thing as well. And he made these little models and so forth. And I was in Basel, in Switzerland, working with a client, and I got a call from Michael one afternoon, and he said they want to talk. And I said, well, okay. And he said, we can get them on the phone. I said, I can't come back. I'm in the midst of this. It's an important client of ours. And he said, okay, we'll get them on the phone. So 7 o'clock at night, they had set up the call, and the whole jury was there. And we were talking. And basically what they were talking about is that they didn't believe our drawings, and they didn't believe these little models because they didn't really think we could do what they wanted us to do. And I assured them that this was possible, that it was you can do this kind of thing. And I thought at the end of the conversation we'd probably done as well as you could have expected. That we'd answered their questions, and basically, like so many client relationships, it's bedside manner. You're sort of assuring them that everything will be okay. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, Michael called me and he said they want to talk face to face. So I said, okay, this is I can fly back Saturday night, go to the Millennium Hotel on 44th Street, and we can go up to Gracie Mansion the next morning and talk to them. And meeting on Sunday. Now there's a jury. There is a really dedicated jury. So I flew in, and it was snowing that night. Beautiful, the whole city. Some of you have been in New York when it snows, and suddenly it's a clean city instead of the way it really is, and it just looks wonderful. So we drove in, and it kept snowing that night. Now, one thing I have to mention is that Michael and I had never met each other. We'd never seen each other face to face. This had all been done on the fax and the phone. And I told him, if we're going to go up to Gracie Mansion, we've got to meet. We can't walk in there, never having shaken each other's hand. And we've also got to meet because we got to get our story straight. We're getting up there. This is an important meeting, and we need to talk about this. So I got him to come at 6:30 in the morning, and we went down to the coffee shop, and there were only a few people in there, people who had hangovers and were trying to recover. Almost nobody in the coffee shop in the hotel. So we took all the drawings that he'd made and the little models, and we rolled them out on the floor. And we talked about what this was, and we talked about what it could be before going up and talking to the jury. So we got in a cab and we drove up about 10 o'clock. We went into Gracie Mansion. And they were down in a big room. It's a banquet room, sitting around, and they were really tired. They were all holding their heads in their hands, and they'd just been through this, and they were just exhausted. And I'm sure they were fighting with each other, as juries do. But when we went in, the LMDC, who were the agency, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, who were the agency in charge, said, "Pete, you answer this question." And basically, they were only asking one question. And the question was, can you do something which is same question. Can you do something which is a park and a memorial without either of those functions or forms compromising the other? Of course, remember, we're petitioners. So I said, well, I really think we can handle that. We can do that. So I went home, flew home on Monday, and that was the whole meeting. It lasted about 25 minutes. So I flew home, and on Tuesday they called us up, Michael in New York and me in San Francisco. And they said, well, look, we think you're the winner, but there are two provisos. And we said, wonderful, what are the provisos? And he said, one is that you have to stay together through the whole course of this. Neither of you can fire the other person, and neither of you can quit. And the second one is that there were some buildings, you can sort of see them in very crude form over here, which are we call the northeast corner, and they were cultural buildings at that time. They were part of Lipscomb's master plan. And they sensed that we were going to argue against those buildings because we wanted everything done. I would argue because they were flat, and Michael would argue because he didn't want any competition. And we were going to argue that. And we said, yes, we'll follow those two rules. And so they said, fine, we're going to have our lawyer write that up, and you're going to sign them, the two of you. So I'm sure they had it already written up. So 20 minutes later, we were emailed those letters. Michael signed his in New York. I signed mine in San Francisco or in Berkeley. And we sent them back, and we had won. Then all hell broke loose. They told us that the following Tuesday, this was a week, they told us the following Tuesday they were going to announce this to the world. And they were going to have this big photo op and press conference, and people were going to, because of the TV and all of the notoriety of this thing, they were going to come from everywhere. And we were going to present this scheme. Now you have to remember, we don't have a scheme. Or put it the other way, we only have Michael's part of the scheme, which again is pretty good, but all we really had are these holes. So we met with the renderers and we met with the model makers, and we had them make renderings that didn't tell what the scheme was because we didn't know what the scheme was. And for the model, I made this little sketch on just a piece of trace, and I put these trees in rows, and there was a dot at the center of each tree. You know how landscape architects draw stuff. And we made it the same size as the model, and we put it on top of the model, and the guy would put a tree on or down in through every dot. And we got halfway through this, and he ran out of trees. This was Saturday. We were getting down there. So Michael says, well, look, why don't you just space them out? And I said, hold it. We need all these trees. And so we went to the guy, wonderful old German guy who was making the models, and we said, we got to have more trees. And so he got his tree maker, and they worked all night long And at 11 o'clock the following morning, they had made all the trees that we needed. And the paper was still on the model, and we pushed them all in, and we were ready for the big show. Now, we went on all the morning television shows. We went on the evening news. We were interviewed by every newspaper in the world. It was an amazing thing. I'd never done anything like this. And Michael's father, who was at one time was the ambassador to the United States from Israel, had a public relations firm that he loaned to us. And the woman said, look, memorize 2 paragraphs, short paragraphs. And no matter what question they ask, answer with one of those paragraphs. And I said, we're going to look stupid. And she said, you have to remember, they're not interested in what you say. This is an event. So we each wrote down our paragraph. And what the hell, I didn't know anything about this. So I went ahead and said it, and it worked perfectly. So the big day, the 2 days, the big days were over. We were out of the green rooms and all of that. And we went back, and our office makes models. And because we didn't know whether our scheme was a bunch of ideas with a couple of images. But we didn't know whether this thing would actually work. And so we made 8-scale models, which are really big. And we can do the trees precisely, and you can look under, and you can place objects in there, whether they're ground covers or whatever, benches. And you can place objects in there, and you can see when you have too many objects and you're destroying the plane. Because our goal was to have that plane very, very powerful, and then the holes cut in them. At this time, the LMDC hired Davis Brody Bond, Max Bond, as the executive architect, again, because Michael had no experience. And they were a real boon. Max Bond is a great guy, was a great guy, died 3 years ago. But he had taught for 25 years. He was dean at CCNY. I mean, he's a fantastic guy, and one of the calmest, gentlest men I've ever met. And believe me, this was a process which you had to be very, very calm. And I don't know how you could stay gentle in it, because it was really chaotic. Remember, we had 10 clients or something, all sort of at us. So these models, and I think Max and I were sort of like bookends. We were guaranteeing that the young architect, wouldn't get into any real trouble. We were supposed to be the gray hairs in the deal. Didn't have any hair, but I wish I had gray hair even. But if we could get this thing through. Now, Michael and Max started in on working on the underground part, which is a lot of really difficult problems. Like, you'd get down there and you were out of sight of the world. You'd go down one or another of the ramps and you'd get down there, and which pool were you next to? Where were you? And what happens when the kid gets lost? Do you have a loudspeaker saying, we have a little boy here, we think his name is Jack? What do you do down there? It's a maze. And people would simply get lost. But the thing that really, and we worked for 2 years trying to figure that problem out, Max and Michael, and as I say, we pretty much got the plaza going in that same period of time. But the thing that really did us in was that when you went down, security is a big thing here, and everybody's terribly worried. If a bomb went off down there, and even if it killed just a few hundred people, because it's the memorial, it would be a huge public relations loss to the United States. And so the security people's idea is you'd go down one side of the ramp, and at the midpoint, you'd go through the airport experience, the puffers, and they'd have a room. If you didn't want to be patted down in public, you'd do the whole damn thing that you do at the airport. And none of us could figure out how you could keep the mood of the memorial, which has to be a very pure, very quiet thing, with this event happening to everybody who went below. And Michael thought he could solve that one, and he really did try. But finally the LMDC, and now this had changed over to the foundation because the LMDC had given it to the foundation, but they thought it wasn't going to work. So in typical political fashion, they announced that the project was horribly over budget, $500 million over budget. You have to remember this thing is about 200 million and the landscape's about 40. So they just pumped it way up. And they said, we can't do this. We're going to have to bring the names up and put them around the pools. Well, imagine yourself, you're a 33-year-old architect, you're at the height of this thing, you know, you're the biggest guy in town. He was crushed. And because he didn't share the view that this was going to be a bad thing for the memorial, he just felt terrible. And he went into a funk for about almost 6 months. And finally the mayor, who was our champion, finally the mayor went to him and said, look, Michael, you got to, pull out of this thing. Why don't you focus on the names? Make those perfect. And so Michael worked the next 3 years or so on getting those names perfect. And they are really good. When you go there, you'll see there's a lot of things about it. So he did a really nice job. We, on the other hand, had some other difficulties. We had, part of my, one of my paragraphs was, when you enter the memorial from the south and the north, you'll walk in like the upper model, you'll walk in and it'll look like a woods. And then you turn your eye or your head 90 degrees and they turn into Gothic colonnades. So that you'd have this geometry playing against the non-geometry, which, because we could do very little, we had to make each thing that we did very important, but not competitive with the plane. But we didn't know whether it would work or not. So we made this quarter scale model and it worked. It really does work. So we were still trying to figure those kinds of things out, even though, we were in the midst of this thing and just about ready to start working drawings. Then Danny Leifskin came out and very nicely, I have to say, told us that we were sitting on top of a 7-story building. Now, I don't know why we weren't told this. And we didn't know what really was underneath us. But the Port Authority was busily building parking garages, chiller plants, some of the subways cut across, all this stuff down below. And they said, we've got to have these vents. We've got to take the air down to these things, there's 7 stories of stuff, and we've got to get the exhaust coming out. And the problem with that is that they figured that the vents had to be 40 feet in the air so you couldn't throw a hand grenade up and down into them. And so I thought we were done. I just thought this was the end of it. So we made this model we call the awful model. Explain why in a minute. And we took it to Governor Pataki, who was still governor. We're now in our 5th governor, but he was governor at that time. And we took it in and showed him and explained what the problem was. And he said, that's awful. That's why we call it the awful model. And he turns to the Port Authority engineers and he said, we can't have this. This isn't any good. And the engineer sort of stood on one foot and another. You ever see bureaucrats, doing that little dance they do? And they said, well, sir, I'm sure we can get rid of a couple of them, and then we could get artists and they could decorate them and everything would be okay. And, Pataki I'm not a Republican, but Pataki's a Republican, but that day he was my friend. And he turned back to me and said, no, you don't understand me. I want them all out of there. So we invented a building called the West Vent Structure, and the engineers had to take all of their vents over and take them up through that building on the edge of the memorial. And that saved the memorial. I've been thinking about this for years, and I don't know what the devil we would have done. That, for me, would have been a stopper. And certainly it would have been the end of my plane, and, my notion of what was important. So he saved the day. Governor Pataki wanted the trees. Trees are a really difficult thing in New York. The average tree lives about 8 years in New York, on average. And it's partly because they're under such stress, but it's also because they're planted very badly. And they just die. And our program was to do something that would last between 80 and 120 years. And on top of that, there were only 5 deciduous trees that the Cornell tree people said that we could use here, because there was something wrong with all of the other trees. And it was wrong with the plane trees, the sycamores. It was wrong with all the red maples. It was wrong with all the silver maples. All of the trees that one would have thought of to make this particular composition were off the list. And the only one left that did what we wanted was a white swamp oak. And you can see up in the left-hand side, that's the long-term nature of a white swamp oak. And we wanted those colonnades to be Gothic, because Yama had, Gothic, when the columns went up, there was a sort of Gothic motif that turned into the World Trade Center. You can see them here. So we went out, and the governor wanted these things to come from New York and the 4 states around it, because most of the people who were killed were commuters. They had come in either from Manhattan or the boroughs or from these states around, New Jersey and so forth. None of them had enough of these trees in their nurseries, because we needed 425 for the project, and we needed another 75 for difficulties that we might have along the way. And we couldn't find 100 big trees in the nurseries. So we worked with a guy named Paul Cowie, great guy, forester, and we sent out our field crew, 4 people from our office, and they scavenged those 5 states. And they found 500 trees. And when we got them to the nursery, they set up a nursery about the same distance from the river on the New Jersey side. When we set them up in the boxes, they were surprisingly alike. Their shapes were all the same, but their sizes were all different, because we couldn't find them all in the same size. Now, we could have found this in Europe, because they have nurseries that are much better than ours, but we weren't allowed to do that on the memorial. It had to be American. So we brought in a firm called Abbott Tree Experts, and they are an amazing group. I'd never worked with them before. We're working with them 3 or 4 times since. And what they did is they set the trees up like when you go in the hospital, and the first thing they do is they put the thing in the back of your fist so they can feed you in case something happens, and they can give you painkillers and so forth. So they stuck each of these trees with a little tube, and they fed the little ones and starved the big ones. And 3 years later, when we were ready to plant, they not only were all perfect shape, but they were all the same size. Never seen anything. This better living through chemistry. So they were ready to go. And this, you can see them at the end of that time when we were just about ready to plant. All the raggedy ones have been fixed. Now, I don't think on any public project you can get agreement on what the right tree is. Everybody knows more than you do. Everybody knows more than the experts, and they all have their favorites and their subjective this and that. So we made these drawings. Chris Grubbs made these drawings, and it was to show what these trees would do during the year, where they start off in the spring and bud out, and then they get very, very heavy leaf in the summer, and then they go through the fall and change their color, and then in the winter they lose their leaves, and they just put a tracery of shadow down when you want sun to come into the site because it's cold, and you can start seeing the trees through them. And I had this little story, more elaborate than that, but that was basically the story. And I presented it dozens and dozens of times to everyone in New York that was all interested in trees. And we finally sold the idea that we could use a monoculture and use this particular tree and do it this particular way. Took about 2 years. Now, the other side of this thing about the trees not living, it was partly the variety of tree, but it was also the fact that they were planted badly. Remember, we're up on top of a 7-story building. So all these trees had to be kept alive, and we couldn't stand 10 or 12 years. We needed to get up in the 80, 90, 100 years. So we built a system which is a series of trenches built on top of the roof of that building below, and those are filled with dirt. And then these walkways that you can get crouch down and get along, and you can get at the trees from these walkways. And you can root prune them, you can feed them, you can do all sorts of things with those trees. And then the plaza, which has a series of drains like this, using the same system that we used in Berlin, where it's a very shallow pitch to the drain, so it looks flat. The water would go down there, and it would be caught, and it would be taken down to two 150,000 gallon tanks, 7 stories down in the bowels of this building below us. Now, I've proposed this thing, I don't know, 10 or 12 times on various projects where we're up on roofs and so forth, all over the United States. And every single time I've proposed it, it's been value engineered away. For some reason, the haste, or when things were being built, or the urgency of getting the spaces down below done, it somehow slipped by the value engineers. So this is the first time we've done it, and those 2 tanks can collect all the rain and snow melt in the spring and take them down and then pump it back up and irrigate the trees and irrigate the lawns and ground cover areas in the fall, or in the late summer and fall when it's hot and dry. So we have this system in. Just to give you one example, we started putting these trees in about 3.5 years ago. The trees that are coming from the nursery are pretty much the same size as the trees we started putting in 3.5 years ago. But the trees that are in place are almost twice the size of the trees that are in the nursery. And we're actually now trying to pump them up a little bit because the new trees are looking small as they come in. They have grown like crazy. Very much like Nasher. Nasher, we got growth that I'd never seen on any project before. The waterfall. We work with a guy named Dan User who does our fountains, did the fountains at Nasher. And Dan in his backyard built a full-scale mock-up of this waterfall. And we've done a lot of waterfalls. We've done some in SPNB, we've done some waterfalls that are somewhat the same height. But we've never done one that was 1,600 feet long, 200 times 8, because one side is 200. Now, the problem with a waterfall is that you've got to put enough water across the weir so that they don't break up, either before they hit the bottom or when wind separates them and you have these holes in the water. And Dan knew this problem. And so he figured, well, he had to put 3/4 of an inch of water across that weir, 1,600 feet, an inch deep. Now, it didn't take any engineering or any energy to let them fall, but you had to pump them up fast enough because there's a torrent of water going across that weir. And it was estimated that between $5 and $8 million a year would be the electric bill on these things. So I thought we were done. So we went back to Dan and said, look, we're not going to get past this. So Dan invented a weir, which is a little like a comb. It's a series of small falls. And what happens is that comb separates them, and there are just a whole series of little tiny waterfalls going down 30 feet. And that reduced this thing down to a little over 10% of the water that was required to fill it. And therefore, water and electricity are almost exactly the same, so it reduced the water or the electricity costs down to the point where we could get through this thing. This also would have been a different scheme. There would be no waterfall because you just simply couldn't afford to operate it. So Dan saved us on this one. We were doing, at this point, working drawings were finished and we were doing all the mock-ups and we were mocking up the wood. In the upper left-hand corner, we drew a whole section of the plaza out in our parking lot in front of our office, very carefully with chalk, to see what the scales were. And then you can see on the lower right-hand what the result of that has been. And these stones were also thought of as having to last 80 or 120 years. And if you go around New York to all the plazas, they say, well, there's not going to be any trucks on that plaza, but of course there are trucks on every plaza. And you can hardly find a plaza, in fact you can't find a plaza any place on 6th Avenue, all those plazas, where the stones haven't cracked. So we said we want to set these stones in sand, which is not done in New York, and we want them to be 3.5 inches deep. We want to build for the ages. And again, a big fight, but we won the fight, and they put them in. So this is sort of what we've done. We worked on the light fixtures. The light fixtures were special. We wanted them to be up in the trees so that they would make the bottoms of the trees glow, which also meant that they had to put their light, had to have lenses to put their light on the paths, which are between the tree rows. And we also had in there the cameras, hidden cameras that are covering this whole area. And Paul Morantz worked on that. The trash cans were a problem because the security people were worried that somebody put a bomb in there and it would blow the trash can, and the bomb wouldn't be so bad, but you'd have trash can all over the place, and that would kill and hurt tremendous numbers of people. We looked all over, and we finally found in Israel a company that made trash cans that don't explode, or when they do explode, they don't fall apart and fly through the air. So this went on a long time, and though there are very few details on this job, the details themselves have taken a lot of time and a lot of care. So we finally got to the point where all this stuff had been agreed upon. And this is a drawing that was made right at the end when we were trying to get our final permissions. The little buildings the cultural buildings on the other side here, Snow Hedda had done it, and this has been, because the tomb area below was gone, it became a museum. And this became the entrance to the museum. And it's a kind of flashy looking building, but what it basically is that's where you go through the airport experience. You go in there and do that, and then you go down an escalator and into the museum. And the museum doesn't have the same requirements as the tomb would have. It's not part of the memorial itself. So all of this had been established. Here are the West Vent structures. So all of that had been done. This is, 5-6 years, and construction began. Now, one of the things that we were trying to do here, it's a little like an Escher. We were trying to have places, because all we were working with was this flat plane, we had to manipulate it in our other artistic ways. And if you walk around, some of the areas look very hard. And you go to other places and they look very green. Actually, it's about 50-50, 50 stone and 50 plant. So you get this kind of Escher effect as you move around. And I was trying to make each of these things which produce scale and interest below the level of the flatness, so that they didn't interrupt your sense of this plane, so that the voids would be on a pure surface. Here we are about 4 days before the big opening. The politicians decided they couldn't wait for the thing to be finished, that they would be criticized if it went beyond 10 years. And this was partly, I think because they'd been making trouble for everybody and everything, and it had gone slow. New York is that way. But it was also because the mayor was leaving this year, and they wanted to get this finished. This is 2 years ago. So I was really petrified, because the big opening, look what was going on all around. Only half of the plaza had been built. And I was afraid that, and this is a construction site, huge construction site. All these buildings are under construction. And I was afraid that this activity, still with cranes and trucks and that beep, 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 when they're backing up, all of this was going on around this place that was supposed to be quiet and sacred. And I really was worried that this was not going to come off. I was having, just before opening, fright. However, the details that we did have were beautiful. We had a great stone contractor. We had a great drainage contractor. All the very simple pieces were coming together in a very elegant way. And the scale was working out. Seemed to be pretty good. And everybody had done their job really beautifully. So the part that we had was in very, very good condition. So the opening day, they let all the families and all the friends of the people who had been killed, so family and other relatives and friends. Somewhere between 20 and 30,000. And I was afraid, remember we only have half the plaza that we will eventually have, and I was afraid this place would be, destroyed in one day. But everybody was very calm, was very respectful. You didn't find people walking across. It wasn't a throwing wrappers on the ground. I mean, it was a wonderfully calm place. And it worked pretty well. And I don't know all the families, there may be 7,000 or 8,000 family members for the 3,000 that were killed. But I know several hundred of them. And those that I knew and those that knew, would come up and throw their arms around us and say, this is just what we wanted. This is beautiful. This is what we've been looking for. We're so proud of what's going on here. So that was, for me, an extraordinarily wonderful day, as you can imagine. It's like the client comes and says, we really love our house. It's changed our family and so forth. I mean, it was one of those perfect days. So the next day, they started letting in, which is also a ceremonial day, they started letting in $1,500 an hour. And some people go fairly slowly through this process. So maybe there are 2,000 in there, not 20, but 2. And it holds that size group pretty well. And right now you have to go through security to get in. I don't know if any of you have gone there, but you have to go through very high levels of security to get in. And then you're free. You can walk around. But it's all fenced. You can't get in and get out except at the entrance they've set. And kids playing, the various things that have happened, the lawns are fine. It seems to be holding up given the amount of people that are coming through. We went through our first fall, so we started getting, that effect that next season. This was after September 11th, perhaps a month later. Paul Morance's lighting really worked. It was beautiful up in the trees, and this is gonna be open 24/7. So people will be coming at 3, particularly in the summers when it's hot. People will be coming down there at 2 o'clock in the morning. So it's planned for having that group come. He did a beautiful job lighting the fountain. Michael and I really think that was sensational. And Paul's very good and can handle, in a very reserved way, huge lighting projects. The other thing that you can see here Dan's weir. Isn't that amazing? The other thing that we found, which was really interesting, is that because it is big, and there's a certain austerity to it. And people came and they would put flowers and flags, and these are basically family and friends. They come up and they put stuff on. And they did the same thing at Vietnam, where they push it into the crack between the panels of the stone. So this was a thing that I hadn't really thought about, but it's a level of detail that the people who are coming have added. On the opening, the first one in was the president, and he walked across, and we saw him on television, we weren't in there, but he walked across, looked into one of the fountains, looked at the names, stood there for a little bit, and they have each year, maybe some of you have been there, they have each year a presentation, and it's not political speeches, it's not prayers, it's just the family members getting up and saying the names of the people who were killed, the victims' names. It takes about 5 hours to get through 3,000 names. And the families might say a little something about the people. Short and very nice. If the politicians are there, sometimes they'll read a poem, but they're not allowed to do anything else. And the mayor has heard on this thing. He won't let any of them, get up and say, look what I did for you, or something like that, like politicians are. And then there was this big flag that the guys who were working on the Freedom Tower, which wasn't finished. And again, I'm not much for giant flags and things, but it was really a nice touch. And that particular time was amazing for us. And by then we'd been working 10 years, or almost 11 years. And the part that we got done seemed to be appreciated. Now, we haven't had architectural criticism. We haven't had the press on us yet. They're going to wait until we're all done, which is kind of nice, actually. We still have a lot of grumbling bureaucrats who didn't get what they wanted and didn't get to shove something around because the mayor wouldn't let them. There's an awful lot of lying going on. And to say that without the mayor, this thing wouldn't have been built. And I don't know quite what's going to happen in the next couple of years without this mayor, although he will still be the chairman of the foundation. So I suspect he will keep protecting us. Without that, the Port Authority and all the other people that are kibitzing, we couldn't have gotten where we are. But I think all of us agree, everybody who's worked on this thing agrees, that the response of the families was probably the greatest reward. And we all know that we cannot satisfy all of those people who want to get their oar into this thing, and want to have their thumb in it. But the family's reaction, pretty uniform reaction, and they don't agree about much of anything. The families are not a unified group, politically all over the lot and everything. But the reaction of the families has been, I think, one of the most rewarding things that I've ever had happen in my whole life, and certainly a perfectly good pay for this 10 years.